This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so imagine you couldn't pick what's for dinner. Like every night, same meal, no options, you just got to eat it. It's a little taste of life without freedom, right?
Right.
But back in 1941, things were way more intense than missing out on pizza night. Germany was on the move, Britain was standing alone, and America was like, do we get involved in this or what?
Yeah, the U.S. was super isolationist back then. Those neutrality acts, they basically made it illegal to get directly involved. And honestly, most Americans just didn't see a war in Europe as their problem.
So how do you flip a whole country's mindset from stay out of it to we got to fight for this?
Right.
Well, this is where FDR's famous For Freedom speech comes in. We're going deep on this, pulling from an episode of Mr. Hutchings History that really breaks down this moment. And believe me, this speech, it wasn't just some feel-good pep talk. This thing, it changed the course of history.
What's so interesting is how FDR totally shifted the narrative. He had to convince Americans that helping Britain wasn't just the nice thing to do.
Yeah.
It was about survival.
So he's walking this tightrope, right? He's appealing to America's ideals, the sense of duty to defend democracy around the world, but he's also making it super clear that if Britain goes down, Hitler is coming for us next.
Exactly. It was masterful, combining moral arguments with strategic ones.
Okay, let's break down each of these freedoms one by one. We'll start with what the podcast says, and then you can help us see what these freedoms look like in our world today. Deal.
Sounds good.
All right, freedom of speech. What's the deal with that one?
So FDR, he saw freedom of speech as way more than just politics, right? It's about artistic expression. It's about scientific inquiry, really anything that lets people contribute to the world of ideas.
So it's bigger than just like ranting online, although I do appreciate that freedom as well.
Think of it this way. Without freedom of speech, we wouldn't have groundbreaking discoveries in science, incredible art, even critical thinking skills. All that stuff that pushes humanity forward. It's the bedrock of an open society.
That's a really good point. Freedom of speech, it's like the foundation of everything. Okay, what about freedom of worship? That feels especially relevant in our world right now, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. In a world with so many different beliefs, freedom of worship, it says you have the right to practice your faith without being persecuted, or even to have no faith at all.
I feel like that freedom is constantly being tested.
Yeah.
Even today, there's so much tension around religion, so much conflict over tolerance all over the world.
For sure. And it shows us that these freedoms, they're not just set in stone. We have to constantly be vigilant. We have to defend them. It's not a one-and-done deal. It's an ongoing process.
Now, let's talk about freedom from want. The podcast mentions this being about economic stability. So what did FDR actually mean there?
It's a bold idea. He's talking about a world where everybody has access to the basic things they need to live. This ties directly into conversations we're having today about poverty and inequality. Like that whole debate around universal basic income. Does making sure everyone has a basic standard of living like FDR imagined, does it require those kinds of big solutions?
So it's not just about like putting food on the table. It's much bigger than that.
It's about creating a society where people aren't always struggling just to get by, a society where everyone has a real chance to thrive.
That really resonates, especially now when the gap between the rich and poor is such a hot topic. Okay, last but not least, we've got freedom from fear. In 1941, that was obviously about the threat of war. But how does that freedom play out in the world today?
That's a good question. The things we're afraid of, they might have changed. But the basic idea, that hasn't changed. Today, freedom from fear, it could be about things like cybersecurity, terrorism, the climate crisis, anything that makes us feel unsafe and insecure. Physically, emotionally, all of it.
So it's about feeling secure, right? In our homes, in our communities, even on a global level. These four freedoms, they cover so much ground. But how did FDR get everyday Americans to actually connect with these big kind of abstract ideas? That's where Norman Rockwell comes in, yeah?
Exactly. Rockwell, he was a genius at taking these lofty ideals and making them relatable. His paintings, they showed ordinary Americans experiencing these freedoms in their everyday lives.
I love what the podcast said about those paintings, especially that one with the Thanksgiving dinner, Freedom from Want. It's so iconic. You can almost smell the turkey, feel the warmth of that family gathering.
That's what makes Rockwell so brilliant. He captures something universal. Everybody wants that happy family meal, no stress, no worries. And by putting freedom from want in that familiar setting, he made the idea real, tangible, you could feel it.
And then they actually use those paintings in war bond drives. That's amazing. Talk about the power of art to persuade. It's like they were saying, hey, you want to protect this heartwarming scene? Then chip in and support the war effort.
It's the perfect example of how art can move people, shape public opinion. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were a key part of rallying support for the war.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting. Mr. Hutchings, he points out that historians, they don't all agree on FDR's real motives with this Four Freedoms speech. Was he truly this, champion of liberty and justice? Or was he cleverly using these ideals to get America what it wanted?
Yeah, that's a debate that's still going on today. The podcast episode, it highlights 4 main schools of thought about this, each with his own take on FDR's motivations and actions.
Lay it on me. I love hearing different viewpoints. It always adds so much depth and nuance to understanding history.
Okay, so first, you've got the realist school. They say FDR, his main concern was always national security. Supporting Britain, even using these freedoms as a rallying cry, it was all ultimately about protecting America's interests.
So kind of like the ends justify the means kind of thing.
Yeah, in a way. Then you've got the moral interventionist school. Historians in this camp, like Robert Dallek, they believe that FDR genuinely believed in these freedoms and that the war was a moral crusade to spread them around the world.
A true believer, huh?
Exactly. Then there's the economic school, which, no surprise, focuses on economic factors. They say FDR was playing the long game, aiming to set America up as the economic powerhouse after the war.
So for them, supporting Britain was also good for business.
You got it. And finally, we have the isolationist school. They're more critical of FDR. They argue that he intentionally manipulated public opinion to drag America into a war we didn't need to be in.
Ah, yes, the classic alternative interpretation. It's so fascinating to think about the motives behind such a pivotal moment in history.
It really is. And that's what keeps studying history so captivating, right? It's rarely black and white. There are always layers of motivation, competing interests, unintended consequences.
So was it all about ideals? Was it cold, hard strategy? Or maybe some complicated mix of both? That's the beauty of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. Unraveling those complexities, that's what keeps us engaged and asking questions. And that process of asking questions, it's just as important as the answers themselves.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to put together this historical jigsaw puzzle, Trying to figure out why people did what they did, what was going on back then.
And sometimes those puzzles, they just lead to more questions.
Totally. But that's what keeps history so interesting, right? It's not like we can hop in a time machine and be like, hey, FDR, what were you really thinking back then?
If only. But that's where historical analysis comes in, I guess. We look at the evidence, try to see things from different perspectives, and then try to put together a story that makes sense of it all.
Which is why we have awesome experts like you to be our guides through these historical twists and turns. But before we get totally lost in all the debates and stuff, let's bring it back to our listener for a minute. What does all this mean for us today? Why should we care about some speech from, over 80 years ago?
Well, because those ideas that FDR talked about in the Four Freedoms, they're still so relevant today. These freedoms, they're not just some dusty old relics from the past. They're the foundation of democracies all over the world.
It's almost like they're the operating system our modern world runs on, And if we don't keep them running smoothly, the whole thing could crash.
That's a great way to put it. We take these freedoms for granted so easily, but they're always under threat, both from outside forces and from us just becoming complacent.
So freedom isn't free, right? We got to work for it. We got to protect it for ourselves and for everyone else around the world.
Exactly. And this brings us to a super important point. Mr. Hutchings mentions that the Four Freedoms, they ended up in the United Nations Charter. That suggests this universal hope, this vision of a world where everybody gets to enjoy these basic rights.
Which sounds amazing, but the reality is?
The reality is a lot messier. In some parts of the world, these freedoms are celebrated, they're protected, but in other places, they're ignored, violated, totally trampled on.
It makes you wonder, are these freedoms truly universal? Or are they shaped by culture, by history, even by politics?
That's a question worth thinking about. And it's something we'll keep wrestling with as our world gets more and more connected, but also more and more divided at the same time.
It's like we all have this deep down desire for freedom, but then you have all these forces trying to limit it, trying to define it in their own way, or even twist it for their own benefit.
And that's exactly why we need to understand what's going on. We need to think critically, have open and honest conversations about what these freedoms really mean, and figure out how to protect them in the best way possible.
So it's not just about knowing history, it's about using that knowledge to do something, to make things better right now, to build a better future.
I totally agree. The past isn't just a bunch of dates and names in a textbook. It can teach us so much. It can help us navigate the tricky stuff we're facing today.
I love that, a wellspring of wisdom. Okay, so let's talk about wisdom for a sec. Out of the 4 freedoms, which one hits home the most for you personally?
That's a tough one. They're all so connected, so important. But if I had to pick, I'd probably go with freedom from fear. I truly believe that everybody deserves to live in a world where they don't have to be afraid of violence, persecution, oppression. It's like the most basic right. It's the foundation for all the other freedoms.
That's a powerful choice, and it says a lot about the kind of world you value, a world that celebrates different beliefs and ways of thinking. What about you? Which freedom speaks to your heart? You know, for me, it's got to be freedom from want. The idea that everyone should have a chance at a good life, that nobody should be crushed by poverty, that everyone's basic needs should be met, and that everyone should have the opportunity to be their best selves. That's what really gets me.
I get that. It's about fairness. It's about compassion. It challenges us to build a world where everyone has a real shot at a good life, no matter what their background is.
Exactly. It pushes us to look beyond ourselves and think about how we can help everyone in our society.
And that's where the real work starts.
Yeah.
Because these freedoms, as amazing as they are, they don't just happen on their own.
Right, it's not like we check them off a list and then we're done. They're just there forever.
We have to work at it. We have to protect them. And that means having tough conversations, questioning what we believe, and really listening to other people, even when they see things differently than we do.
It's like you said earlier, these freedoms come with responsibilities, right? What did you mean by that?
Okay, so think about it like this. My freedom to do what I want, it shouldn't step on your freedom, right? Like my freedom of speech, it shouldn't turn into hate speech that hurts other people.
Yeah.
My freedom to do things, it shouldn't make you feel unsafe or put you in danger. Finding that balance where we can all be free, but also respect each other's rights and dignity, that's the challenge.
So it's like we have to be aware of how our actions and words affect other people. Real freedom means understanding that our freedoms are tied to the freedoms of everyone around us.
Exactly. It takes empathy, it takes compassion, and it takes being willing to listen and learn from people who have different experiences and viewpoints.
It's a constant process of learning, changing, and working towards a world where everyone can thrive. That's a pretty inspiring thought.
It is, and it's something that every generation has to face. We inherit these freedoms, but we also inherit the responsibility to keep them safe and pass them on to the next generation, hopefully even stronger than before.
Very well said. Okay, one last thought for our listeners as we wrap up this deep dive into the 4 freedoms. We talked about how these freedoms ended up in the UN Charter, this hope for universal rights. But like Mr. Hutchings asks, are they really universal? Where do we see them being protected and celebrated? And where do we see them being challenged and violated in our world today?
That's a question I want everyone to really think about. Look around you. Pay attention to what's happening in the news. Talk to people from different backgrounds and cultures. The more we understand about freedom, the more we'll be able to protect it for ourselves and for future generations.
What a powerful way to end this conversation. All right, everyone, that's it for today. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep talking about freedom.
Wow, it's amazing, isn't it? Like how a speech from way back then, over 80 years ago, can still get us thinking and talking in such a deep way today.
It is.
But that's the thing about ideas, especially ideas about freedom. They really have staying power.
And these conversations are not just theoretical, you know? They have real-world impact. They shape how we live our lives, how we treat each other, how we build our societies.
So let's get a little personal for a minute. We've been talking about these 4 freedoms in a big picture way, but now I'm curious, for you personally, if you had to pick one that really resonates with you, which would it be and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. They're all so intertwined, you can't really have one without the others. But if I had to choose, I think I'd go with freedom of worship. For me, it represents the core of individual liberty, you know? It's about respecting every person's right to believe what they want, to follow their own conscience, to practice their faith or not without being forced or punished. That's a powerful choice. And it says a lot about the kind of world you believe in, a world where different beliefs and ideas are welcomed and respected. How about you? Which freedom speaks to you the most? For me, I think it's freedom from want. The idea that everyone deserves a chance to live a life without being crushed by poverty, to have their basic needs met, to have the opportunity to really reach their full potential. That's something that's always been important to me.
I can see that. It speaks to a deep sense of justice and compassion.
Mm.
And it challenges us to create a world where everyone has a genuine opportunity to thrive, no matter where they come from or what their circumstances are.
Exactly. It's a call to look beyond ourselves and work towards a society where everyone can have a good life.
And that's where the real work starts.
Yeah.
Because these freedoms, as beautiful and inspiring as they don't just maintain themselves.
Yeah, it's not like we achieve them once and then they're just guaranteed forever, right?
We have to be active. We have to protect them. And that means being willing to have tough conversations, challenge our own beliefs, and really listen to perspectives that might be different from our own.
You mentioned earlier that these freedoms come with responsibilities. What did you mean by that?
Well, think about it this way. My freedom to do what I want shouldn't take away from your freedom, right? Like, I have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean I can use it to spread hate and hurt other people. I can do what I want, but not if it's going to put you in danger or make you feel unsafe. It's about finding that balance where we can all be free, but also respect each other's dignity and rights. That's the challenge.
So it's about being mindful of how what we say and do affects other people. True freedom means understanding that our freedoms are connected to everyone else's freedoms.
Exactly. And that takes empathy, compassion, and a willingness to learn from people who see the world differently than we do.
It's a constant journey, isn't it? Learning, growing, and working towards a world where everyone can truly be free.
It is. And it's a journey that every generation has to take on. We inherit these freedoms, but we also inherit the responsibility to protect them, pass them down to the next generation, hopefully making them even stronger.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So, to everyone listening who's joined us on this deep dive into FDR's 4 freedoms, I encourage you to take these ideas and really think about them. How do they show up in your own life, in your community, in the world around you? Because in the end, the future of freedom depends on people like you who are engaged, informed, and active.
And remember, this conversation isn't over. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a world where everyone can experience these freedoms.
What a fantastic message to end on. And on that note, we'll sign off for today. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep those conversations about freedom alive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.